So the end of the war happens on November 11th, 1918. Now this is Armistice Day, it's Veterans Day, whatever you'd like to call it, that's how we celebrate it today. But it occurs on the 11th hour of the 11th month, of the 11th day of the 11th month. Okay, so the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. That's when the armistice is signed. Interestingly enough, France is going to make Germany sign the armistice in a train car. And when Hitler rolls into Paris several years later and conquers France, that same train car is used to make France sign the capitulation. So, interesting irony here. Now, Wilson... Germany asks Wilson, they go directly to Wilson before they sign the armistice and say, okay, we're done, we give up, we're raising the white flag, we want to have an armistice, but we want you, Woodrow Wilson, to lead the peace talks because we want a peace based on the 14 points. Those are things we can live with. And Wilson happily agrees because that was his goal. Peace based on the 14 points. Now, Wilson makes it very clear to the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, that you have to leave Germany. You're done. You're out. You have to go. So the Kaiser willingly packs his bags and he heads to the Netherlands. He would later be tried for war crimes, but this was not Wilson's original goal. The U.S. is only going to fight in this war in really two major battles, Saint-Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne. Those are the only two really major battles that we see action in. What we do, however, because our troops got there so late, we weren't able to fight in a lot of major battles. And the battles, remember, last a long time in this war. What we do, however, is we provide food, fuel, oil, weapons, money, lots of money, and then eventually we supply the men. Without our men, the Allies would not have been successful in this war. Now, Wilson himself, Woodrow Wilson is very popular in Europe. They love him over there. He was not so popular in the United States. He was sort of getting some pushback from the people of the U.S., especially in the Senate. But in Europe, he was really seen as a moral leader of the world. So when he arrives in Paris, they throw him the biggest party ever, parades on the Champs-Élysées, and he's just really escorted around town like he's nobility. Now, the problems that Woodrow Wilson's going to face, there are several, and most of these problems have to do with his interactions back in the United States, because the Republicans, remember, had won over the Senate and Congress in 1918. They were really making a surge. So by the time Wilson gets to Paris, it's 1919, and the Republicans are in firm control of Congress. So here's the problem. He's the first president to travel to Europe. Now remember that we had only had one president before that had traveled to Latin America while he was president. This is the first president that travels to Europe as president, and that gets a lot of pushback because people weren't happy that he left the United States to go to Europe. How dare you leave us to go there to settle their problems? Settle your problems here. 1918, the Republicans win over Congress, so that's a big deal because they're firmly in control. No Republican was on the peace delegation. When Wilson puts together the people that are going to go to Paris to represent the United States in the Treaty of Versailles talks, he puts no Republicans on it. It's all Democrats. And the Republicans are livid. They're angry over this because they really felt they had earned their place to at least somewhat represent the United States, and yet we had no voice. The Republicans had no voice there whatsoever. His biggest competition is going to be, or his biggest opposition is going to be Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, Henry Cabot Lodge was the man in charge of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, so he's a big deal when it comes to treaty confirmation. And he's a senator from Massachusetts, so we're going to see some pushback from Henry Cabot Lodge. He'll just keep re-emerging here. Now, when Wilson gets to Paris, there's the big four that are involved in this treaty negotiation. From the United States, you have Woodrow Wilson, obviously. From Italy, you have Premier Vittorio Orlando. Now, how much of a role does Italy play in the Treaty of Versailles talks? They try really hard to play a significant role because they felt like, hey, we were on the winning team. We should have a role in this, and we're part of Europe. So this directly affected us. They really kind of get pushed back a little bit by the demands of France and Great Britain. Representing Great Britain was the Prime Minister, who was David Lloyd George. And then representing France was the Premier, Georges Clemenceau. Now, everybody's going to meet at Versailles Palace, which is this grand palace. It was actually built as a hunting lodge for, I believe it was Louis XII built it, and it's 14 miles outside of Paris. So it's not terribly far from Paris itself. It's an easy day trip if you want to go out and visit Versailles while you're visiting Paris at some point. We'll be there this summer, it's a beautiful, beautiful palace. And the actual meetings for this treaty take place in what's called the Hall of Mirrors. And the Hall of Mirrors is this long hallway that goes down. The palace itself is built like a U, and the back wing of the palace is particularly long, and it has a view out onto the gardens of Versailles, which are gorgeous, fountains and gardens and really elaborate. And then the other side of that room, you have windows on one side, you have mirrors on the other. So the mirrors reflect the gardens and the windows, which is really quite incredible. It's a beautiful room. It was meant as a ballroom, and so that's where they meet. Remember that Wilson's #1 goal is to establish and form the League of Nations for all nations to be a member of, and this was meant to be a sort of an international parliament for countries to resolve their differences in. That was his #1 goal. Now, what does the Treaty of Versailles look like? What are we looking at the end? First of all, it's done pretty quickly. The leaders of Europe really felt it was best to get this thing wrapped up as quickly and as expeditiously as possible because they had a couple of concerns. The first concern was a fear of communism. Because of the Russian Revolution, there were like sort of sparks of revolution popping up in various countries, and those countries that were involved in the Treaty of Versailles wanted to get back home to quell any sparks that might have blown up in their country. So that fear of communism sort of puts the hurry on things. The other reason they have to hurry is that Wilson has to leave the treaty talks early because there's trouble at home. There's trouble back in the United States with the Republican senators and Republican congressmen, and he has to leave. Now, that charge against him was led, of course, by Henry Cabot Lodge. And then he's joined by William Borah from Idaho and Hiram Johnson from California. Those three would really take up the charge of trying to defeat this treaty. Now, what do the French demand? The French were the ones who really had the most demands for this treaty. They wanted to cripple Germany in a way that they would never be able to rise up and take Germany or take France again. So they demand money, reparation payments, and both France and Great Britain demand payments. Combined total, $442 billion. That's insane at that point in time. There was no way Germany could ever possibly repay $442 billion in reparations in 1920. It wasn't going to happen. So even your top economist at the time, John Maynard Keynes, even he comes out and he says, this is not going to work. This treaty's insane. There's no way Germany can pay this back. And what we see happen later on is that Germany tries to pay it back because they know if they don't, they're going to lose land to France, because that was the deal. You either pay or you lose. They try to pay it back by literally printing extra money and putting it out on the market. Well, we know that that just causes massive inflation, and that's where Germany hits the skids right before the Great Depression. Germany's in a depression long before the rest of the world because of this act of trying to pay back these reparations and printing that extra money. France also wants land, and they had two real demands. They wanted the land that was called the Rhineland on southwestern Germany, and they also wanted the Saar Valley, which is also in the southwest of Germany. Now, both of these pieces of land, the problem here is that they're both occupied by German residents. People from Germany live there, and France wants it. These are not French people. They do not practice a French culture. They do not speak the French language. They do not follow the French government. But France wants it. And why do they want it? Because there were natural resources here that France thought they could really benefit from. The end of the treaty says basically that France would get neither piece outright. What's going to happen is the Rhineland's going to remain with Germany, but the Saar Valley, that is going to become a protectorate of the League of Nations. The League of Nations is going to sort of oversee and run the Saar Valley for 15 years. So until about 1935. Think about your timing there. So Hitler is just becoming installed in Germany and making a fuss there. And we're right at the outbreak of World War II, okay? So the Saar Valley is going to remain a protectorate of the League of Nations. They're going to watch over for 15 years. And in 1935, there's going to be a vote in the Saar Valley by the people that live there. Do you want to go with Germany or do you want to go with France? What's your pick? And the people of the Saar Valley say, we want to be with Germany, because remember, they're Germans. This was not rocket science. So the last thing that France wants that's slightly controversial, okay, in the United States it's majorly controversial, is they want a security treaty. They want all of the allies, Britain, United States, France, to agree that if France is ever invaded by Germany again, we will step up and defend them, and we'll get involved. Well, Wilson agrees to this, and it goes in the treaty. The problem is that aren't we a country that practices non-entangling alliances? Don't we practice neutrality for the most part? This really puts us in an entangling alliance, and it gets kind of shaky. And then in the treaty also is what's called the War Guilt Clause, and that War Guilt Clause firmly places the blame of World War I squarely on the shoulders of Germany. They are solely to blame for this war. Remember back to when the war started with the assassination of the Archduke? Was Germany involved in that? Yeah, I don't think so either. So this was an interesting clause that went in there, and Germany's really not happy about it. They were not happy that they got blamed for this war, and Hitler would remind them of this in the 1930s. Now, the final treaty is not based on the 14 points. There's only about 4 of the 14 points that are in the final treaty. But because Wilson wasn't there, and because the people that were negotiating this treaty in Europe knew that Wilson was having problems back at home, they took advantage of that knowledge to sort of break up those 14 points and do away with what they didn't want. Wilson was willing to sacrifice everything to make sure he got his beloved League of Nations. And he does get it. There is a League of Nations formed after this treaty. This World Parliament comes to be. Now, the treaty in the United States, basically, there's hostility shown toward the treaty from all sides. Republicans, Democrats, socialists, nobody likes the treaty. It's just really a mashup of all these different ideas, and nobody can really get on board with it. Lodge is the main opponent, okay? That should be clear. Woodrow Wilson, he senses that his treaty is in danger of not being confirmed by the Senate. It takes a 2/3 vote by the Senate to confirm a treaty and make it valid, and he senses that that's probably a long shot because the Republicans are so against the treaty, and they hold the majority in the Senate. Now, Lodge doesn't really know what to do with the treaty at this time, so he has a whole mess of hearings to sort of delay any final action, and so he could sort of work out a plan of how he was going to go about attacking or changing the treaty. He didn't really want to kill it, he just wanted to change it. So Woodrow Wilson, sensing that this hostility exists, he goes on a publicity tour, much to his doctor's dismay. They had all warned him that you should probably not do this cross-country speech-making tour, because your health stinks. You're old, dude. You need to stay home and rest. You are exhausted from having to deal with this war and the treaty and everything. This is not a good idea. But he goes out on this speech-making tour, and that's in September of 1919. He goes to the Midwest, where the reception of the treaty was okay. It was lukewarm. He goes to the West, where the reception of the treaty was actually quite good. They actually welcomed the treaty. They liked the idea. But in the West, we didn't have this isolationist fear like we did on the East Coast. He is at one point rushed back to D.C. because his health was failing big time. And they knew he was on the verge of a major breakdown as far as his physical health went. So they rush him back to Washington, D.C., where he suffers a stroke. After that stroke, he's paralyzed on the left side of his body, and he's basically incapacitated for the next 7.5 months. He lays in bed in the White House and is not able to perform the duties of being the President of the United States. So why didn't the Vice President take over? Why didn't the Council take over? Well, they didn't take over because that amendment to the Constitution wasn't written yet. There was no plan for who takes over if the president becomes incapacitated. So who took over? His wife. His wife, Mrs. Wilson, Edith Wilson, takes over, and she becomes basically the acting president. And now obviously the public didn't know this because they would have had a fit, and the Republicans didn't know it because they would have had a fit. But she really makes a lot of decisions at his bedside that perhaps she shouldn't have made. So when you look at your first woman president, maybe you have to go back to Mrs. Wilson. Now, obviously she was never elected, so we don't call her the first woman president, but she certainly acted as such. Now, Lodge amends the treaty. He takes the treaty, my spelling stinks. He takes the treaty and he amends it. He adds riders to it, and he adds what are called his 14 formal reservations. This is no coincidence that there were 14 of them. This is a real slap in the face to Wilson. You want your 14 points? I got 14 formal reservations for you. His biggest reservation was Article 10. This is not Article X, it's Article 10 of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Article 10 is the security treaty. That's the one that says that if anybody winds up at war with Germany again or with an aggressive invader coming into their country, that the rest of us, England and the United States, France, will step up to help them. This is an entangling alliance. Lodge hates it. He's an isolationist. He has no interest in this alliance. So that Article 10 is what Lodge really wants to go after. Now, Woodrow Wilson, after these 14 formal reservations are enacted and so forth, or added to the treaty, Woodrow Wilson is in a better place physically now. He's able to sort of respond to things. Well, he hates the new treaty. He hates it. And he tells the Democrats in Congress, he says, if these 14 formal reservations are on that treaty, vote no to it. Don't approve it. I don't want that treaty. I want the original treaty. So the treaty is going to fail by a vote of like 55 to 39, okay? It fails. It needs 2/3. It needs a 2/3 vote to be approved. It fails to get that 2/3 vote. All right, the election of 1920. Now, we all know what happens in a zero-numbered year ever since, 1840. The president's going to have an issue. So having his vice president here is a good idea. That's why I have them listed. So the Republicans are going to run Warren G. Harding. Now he was a senator from Ohio. We're still sort of on this Ohio kick where we have lots of candidates and presidents from Ohio. So he's a senator from Ohio, and his running mate is going to be Governor Calvin Coolidge. Calvin Coolidge is from Massachusetts, same state as Henry Cabot Lodge, okay, who was a senator. So that's the Republicans' choice, Harding and Coolidge. The Democrats are going to run James M. Cox, who's the governor of Ohio. So see how that works? You've got the governor and the senator of the same state running against each other for president. Interesting, isn't it? What's in Ohio? Must be something in the corn. And then his running mate is going to be FDR. Now, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy at this time. That's the same post that Theodore Roosevelt held at one time as well before we went to the Spanish-American War. FDR now holds that same post. FDR and Theodore Roosevelt are cousins, okay? Not first cousins. They're more like third or fifth cousins. But they know each other and followed each other in politics. Different political parties, however. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican and FDR is a Democrat. All right, now, Harding wins this election, hands down. There really wasn't any competition. The Republicans were definitely on a roll here, and they had won Congress in 1918. They're going to win the presidency in 1920. This is a notable election for a couple of reasons. Number one is that It's the first nationwide election in which women participate. It's the first time women had suffrage. So that's a big deal. It also is a return to normalcy. We're done with the war. We're done with the treaty process. This is over. We're going to return to a sense of normalcy. We're going to become isolationist in our views. We're going to focus on the United States. It's what we do after every major war, and that's the plan. So that was Harding's mantra, is return to normalcy. Now, Wilson's going to die in 1924. What happens with the treaty? Well, in 1920, they had to revisit the treaty again, and they brought it back to the floor to be voted on, and Wilson again tells the Democrats, don't vote for it, because it still has those 14 formal reservations from Henry Cabot Lodge, so we're not interested. So the treaty again dies in 1920. It's never ratified. The treaty, the peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary, there's a peace with Austria-Hungary that's done in the mid-1920s, but the peace with Germany doesn't happen until World War II. The League of Nations is formed because of the treaty. The League of Nations is formed, but the United States never joins. We are never a member of the League of Nations because we never ratified the treaty, and we refused to join the League of Nations because we felt it was an entangling alliance. So there's your wrap-up.